selling modestly First Heroes, because I did the same thing when I first did my Death Zone comic, which is my fan comic, a Suicide Squad fan comic, and I couldn't give it away. You know what I mean? It was tough because, and I get it, like the audience didn't know what it was. It's an unknown quantity, right? So that was like that was a pretty humbling experience. But you come back, you return, you build that momentum, issue by issue. You just kind of have to do your thing. And Death Zone, if you don't know, led to Cobra, which is my main series. So I don't know, it's been super interesting to see it like develop in that way. From a zine, a hand stapled thing to like an image comic. I think it's pretty awesome. That's a short of it, pretty much. Yeah.
I'm curious for the audience. Can we have a show of hands of creators in the audience? Yeah. I feel like part of this panel is going to be kind of that behind the scenes, journey and how we get to this point. And Michel, I think that's a great illustration. My first comic convention, I had a similar experience of not being able to give away comics. One thing that will happen at these shows often is, you sit down and you sort of greet your neighbors, whoever's tabling next to you and whatever. And I think a polite move is you introduce yourself by the work that you make. And one of the first shows I ever did, I handed the table next to me copies. They flipped through, handed it right back. So I couldn't even give it to a fellow creator.
Yeah, I call it trading upward, man. Like when you're doing your very first shows, nobody really knows your name or anything like that. I think it's your duty to come packed with at least 50 copies of whatever you have to sell, and go home with 0. Trade those things around, introduce yourselves to people, and come home with some cool, interesting comics. You just made a friend at that show, and then you trade upward. So next year you'll sell a couple things, and then hopefully you hit an exponential spurt.
I think my first SPX, I probably gave away like 50 copies of the little mini comic I made. I still have nightmares about those being out there.
Don't we all?
I wish I could get them all back.
Wait, Jim, who were you sitting next to?
Let's
Come on,
names.
see, I think I know, and I had the same experience. I'm crushed. You can't even keep it. You can't even fake it.
Yeah,
come on, man.
We used to play the game. You trade comics with everybody, and we would play the game of sticking them in each other's like take-home bags. And we would do this with everyone, so it wasn't just a slam against the quality of the work. I remember stuffing Evan Dorkin books into somebody else's bag. So it was partially getting rid of comics we couldn't haul home, and partially trying to load down our friends' bags with paper being about as heavy as bricks. So
yeah, that happens when you fly to a convention and you can't, you don't want to check bags.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a good idea.
So one thing I think we all have in common is genre comics. And Chuck, I'm interested in some of the moves that we kind of make and pivot. You come back from a show with disappointing sales, you continue to plow forward, but maybe you make a new book. You go from Death Zone to Cobra, and you've done a couple of moves, Chuck, that I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
One being the Oily Comics distro.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people are familiar with that. Can you talk a little bit about what that was and how that experience influenced what you've done since?
Yeah, I think this was around, 2011. I was sort of in a lull. I was in between projects, and my friend Max de Rodriguez, he's a Belgian cartoonist, did a book called Moose, and he started that as this $1 mini comic, black and white. It's a mini comic. It wasn't like I hadn't seen one before, but for some reason in that moment, it sort of flipped a switch in my head, and I was like, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take off all the anxiety and expectations of doing like a great big graphic novel and worrying about a readership or an editor wanting to buy it or whatever. And the idea of doing this small 10-page chapter by chapter mini comic, selling it for $1, black and white, took away all that stuff. It was just like a trick to like get rid of all that anxiety and just focus on having fun again and doing a story. And it was kind of improvisational when I started it. And the reaction was pretty immediate. A few issues in, I could tell, even just like from my friends, were like, "Oh man, this is different than what you've done before." So I knew I was sort of on a new path. That was a good thing. And I just and I got myself on that monthly schedule, and it just felt great. So of course, I wanted everyone to have that feeling. So I started this thing, Oily Comics. I just started asking friends and other cartoonists I admired. None of them, Michael DeForge was probably the most famous one I asked, but it was mainly like people, at my level that I wanted, because I had like a subscriber list of maybe 300 people. So I was like, oh, cool, I can get this stuff in front of those people, all this stuff I'm reading and that my friends are making. So it became like every month, 5 mini comics that I was printing and stapling in my house and shipping out to a small subscriber list. And it was like a 2-year thing that I kind of did by accident. I never expected to be a publisher. I mean, it was barely a publisher. It was more like a printer or something. And it was awesome. I got carpal tunnel for a little bit, but that went away after I kind of slowed it down. But that was a big transition. It taught me that I love serialization, which was sort of not in vogue in our side of comics, and it's something I still do to this day. I still like all my stories I serialize chapter by chapter.
And we should mention that the end of the effing world comes through that system.
Yes. Yeah.
How many copies can you project were printed of the Xerox issue on a per issue basis?
Yeah, I think in the beginning it was probably like 100 copies, like at a time. I would reprint them. Probably at the height it was 400 or 500. With the first batch. But I would keep them in print, so I would keep printing them. So it was like, I don't really know the numbers exactly.
I'm always fascinated when I get to know and meet cartoonists how there is this common ground we all share where, because it's a sedentary thing, because it's kind of like a lonely enterprise, everybody has their own tricks to manipulate their mind to keep cozy while they're sitting there making comics. So that idea of doing the serialized thing, not being bound by deadlines or whatever, doing those 8-page bits, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I do is looking at the blank piece of paper is often a bit crippling sometimes, man. So I just simply created templates for myself that have little blue lines everywhere, and just the act of not seeing a completely white sheet makes me feel really comfortable at the beginning of the day. Another trick that I do is make sure I work a little extra late on a Sunday, so that when that Monday, that fresh week, business week begins, there's at least something on that piece of paper when I begin the next week. What are some things that you guys might do to kind of trick your mind to get in the drawing chair, prevent artistic blocks or whatever?
I do thumbnails for pages, so I even though it's a blank page that I'm approaching, I kind of know what's going on that page, and the thumbnails are good for overcoming any kind of block because they're drawn in seconds, in margins. Like I would print out my scripts and I would staple them together so I could carry them on the road very easily. So it was basically like a very rough book. But I would have one page of script and then the back page of the other script was just blank, and that's where I would do my thumbnails. So you could do them anywhere. Like if you had 5 minutes somewhere waiting in an office or something, it was perfect. And the thumbnails are just, they're illegible for anyone else. There's no pressure in the drawing of them. Sometimes I might do 20 thumbnails, but it's very easy to do because they're just quick scribbles. You're sort of setting up what that composition is going to be and working out details in later stages. And the more I did that, the more it was free of these don't have to be perfect. They're really just the scribble to get it going, and shapes start to emerge, compositions start to emerge, and it really helps. And then I started making templates digitally that I would then print out, so my pages weren't blank to begin with. They would have maybe blue lines ruled that show me where borders were and things like that.
I think my trick is just to pretend I work in DC Comics 1988.
So you got Julie Schwartz breathing down your neck or something?
Or Dixie down, actually. Not to get too geeky about it, but
this is the Kayfabe. The audience knows what they're in for.
Michel, Chuck mentioned working on that monthly deadline schedule, and one of the things that really stood out to me early on with Cobra was that kind of schedule, and you were also doing the mailing list. Were you guys in contact with each other at that time? Can you speak about what the deadline, that monthly schedule, meant to your production? Any reflections on that?
I was a huge fan of the early comics. I remember working at Bergen Street Comics and receiving that package. Every time you received it, it was more exciting than the regular shipment. It was awesome to keep track of it. And he actually inspired me to go have a subscription for Cobra. At first, I was just going to do it month by month and just hope that someone bought it with a low print run. But he was like, yeah, just make a subscription and build the audience like that. So I kind of took a note from him in that regard. But creatively, I just wanted to do, I wanted to be less precious about my work, and making a 24-page comic in a month seemed realistic. You know.
Wow.
But I had to do it myself.
Not in my house.
But I had to do it myself, which is quicker rather than wait for like the writer to, you know, give me the plot or the letter to finish up. So that's pretty quick, actually, right? 24 pages in a month. But because I couldn't be precious, I couldn't redraw if it looked a little off. That's the way it lived, and so I pretended like there was an editor waiting for me, and the book had to come out and live on the newsstand. And I had to live with the results, and I haven't gone back and changed anything. Looking at those older issues is a little tough because of that, because, you know, and it's funny how that represents me in a way. When I came from a more, not super refined, but, you know, my earlier work like Zegas and such, I took forever on that stuff. I was the slowest artist. I was really meticulous about that. So Cobra was really big change and process for me.
What was the pace? Like, how long did you keep that pace up on Cobra? That month?
About 12 months. 12 months.
Yeah, good
Yeah.
solid year.
When I did the subscription, that was a promise to the readers. I'm like, I better deliver a
And you
product
fulfilled?
every issue.
You fulfilled
Every 12 issues, yeah.
You're the exception to the rule, man. On the YouTube channel, one of the things I always talk about when we pull out like an independent comic that has the little coupon for the subscription service, it's like, they never made good on these things, man. Like, that book was never loaned for the world, and you would never get that subscription money back. Yeah, so you guys are the exceptions to the rule.
No, that was, returning money was not fun. I did not want to do that, so I had to fulfill that.
And you came out of it unscathed, man. You look really healthy. many have tried, many have failed to do that monthly grind, and it plays havoc on one's psyche very often.
Yeah, but it was fun. I mean, that's what you do. You just stay in your studio and didn't do anything else. So I was fortunate to have that privilege.
You guys, when I think about your work, you both make moves, you know, after doing very meticulous, what would be like alternative comics, you know, more thoughtful literary kind of work. You both make moves into this genre stuff. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. You know, is that just saying, the hell with this, I'm gonna do what I want? Is it perceiving that there's an audience for that? Because I remember that being pretty fresh whenever, you know, you moved to Revenger, you moved to Cobra, like, there weren't a lot of comics, there might still not be a lot of comics like that, but it seemed pretty surprising.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a lot of thoughts in my head about why that happened. I think part of it was just, I think a lot of people our generation, especially what this show that you guys do shows, is that we're, you know, like in the 90s, there were battle lines drawn between like alternative comics, mainstream.
Yeah, we ain't snobs like
Yeah,
wearing clouds, man.
But like we grew up reading.
They like that stuff.
Yeah.
They do, man. Klaus if you sat with Klaus, he can
Yeah.
tell you about the Jerry Conway re-edits and rewrites on Marvel's Greatest Team or whatever, the Fantastic Four reprints, where the pop culture references are updated from Stan Lee into the 70s. I digress.
Yeah, but I think people our age and definitely younger grew up reading all that stuff, and we sort of realized, you know, I mean, there were times in my life where I was like, superhero shit sucks, and I wouldn't look at it because I thought it was better than that or something. But then I just started, you know, and Michel and Ben Mara were huge influences. Like when they started doing that genre type stuff, it made me go back and like start rereading the stuff I read as a kid and with adult eyes and seeing new stuff to love and discovering stuff I'd never seen, you know, which we do a lot, you know, the bin divings and the cheap bins, find that black and white self-published stuff with all that passion in there is really inspiring. So yeah, and I just get bored. Like if I start feeling like I'm doing the same story over and over again, I want to really, you know, that's sort of my thing. Like all my books look really different. I call myself a stylist cartoonist because I just like to draw in different ways. So like Revenger for me, like, you know, it was a hard jump to make to do that sort of thing. Like I was a little scared because I was like, oh, everybody knows me as this teenage story type guy. Like, what are they going to think of this? But, you know, was just like, I couldn't get it out of my head, so I was like, I'm just gonna put my all into it and see what happens.
Do you find that you have separate readerships, or do they all kind of they read all of your
I think
stuff?
so. Oh yeah, sure, for sure. Yeah, and that was sort of an enticing thing. Like I always, I think Michel has this where we want the Wednesday Warriors to like us, like secretly, and not so secretly. Yeah. No, I think part of me was like a little obsessive about cracking the people who go to comic book shops and get their Wednesday comics and like tricking them into reading my stuff. I think that was sort of a fascinating thing, that an obsession that I was sort of going for.
That's why I kept my format traditional, like 20 some odd pages, and that the price point was specific, because printing those things on a different quality paper, it could have been a pricier, art book level type, but I wanted to have regular readers. I want them to come back next month and just drop that exact change. But that was a big part of it too.
Yeah.
I think the remarkable thing about Chuck is his shift in styles. I don't think that's discussed enough. Like he was doing, like the teen angst, that simple line, and then he just went straight into this sort of almost like superhero.
Like a classic
Not quite superhero, but like just really rendered action comic.
Yeah.
It's like two different people, and he pulled it off.
Yeah, it's sort of like putting on different costumes for each project. That's how I think of it. But like when I was in school, I had a portfolio review with Ivan Brunetti, and I was complaining that I didn't have a style, and he just told me, like, hey, don't worry about it, just keep working, it'll come through. And in a certain sense, I think that's good advice. But at some point, I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna lean into this and just draw different ways. And I've had a lot of fun doing that. And I know I probably do have a style. People tell me they recognize my work anywhere, but
I feel like we could start a support group for this.
Yeah.
That
I'm sure
drawing in
everyone
different
has
ways
this.
is
Yeah.
one of those things that I have done as a result of struggling with as
Yeah,
similar style.
and it also sort of leads in, like when you asked before about like tricks to get yourself working and not get stuck. That's a big part of it. What I do, I'm sure you have the same experience when you start a new book. There's thousands of decisions you have to make, and it can be very overwhelming. So, like what I do is like, oh, I'm going to draw this way. I'm going to use this tool. I'm going to use this grid on this size paper, and that it helps cut down on the amount of decisions, and that really helps me get going. Even if I start breaking all those rules later in the book, it just helps you, get going. Putting up fences, you have to drive right here.
Let me know if this trajectory speaks to any of you guys up here, but as a peer group, we're basically the last vestige of the newsstand comic book reader who was able to go to the grocery store with mom, have some spinner racks, and you could choose a bunch of comics. We grew up within the speculation boom. I'm sure each of us, between the four of us, have 100 copies of Spider-Man 1, X-Force 1, and X-Men 1. So we were growing up in that system, and the implosion happens in the late mid-90s. Mainstream comics was just garbage, like total garbage. That's when I really started to discover really heavily, in part thanks to Wizard Magazine, Palmer's Picks, pointing me toward Acme Novelty Library, 8-Ball, Hate, the great Fantagraphics books, drawn quarterly, David Mazzucchelli's Rubber Blanket. So I think that might be a part of, that's certainly in my DNA and why I kind of straddle those lines of independent and mainstream. And I wonder what the genesis of all this stuff is for you guys.
Well, my first comic shop was really 7-Eleven. That's where I got all my stuff.
Mine was Rite Aid.
Yeah, I had Eckerd's down in South Florida, but that's where I got my comics. I was at the mercy of whatever that clerk ordered that month, That's how I absorbed comic books. So yeah, I miss that newsstand distribution sort of system. Or
That's like the closest to newsstand.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, right.
Didn't have a newsboy hat, like slinging papers.
Right.
That was welcome.
Right, to get candy and cigarettes too.
Right.
But to speak to your earlier question about genre too, I mean, it's all connected, right?
Yeah.
It's like we sort of grew up with this sort of type of comic book, and then we outgrow it naturally, and we discovered things like Love and Rockets and the Comics Journal. That changed, both those things personally changed everything for me, right? discovering Love and Rockets in that documentary. You know, you're 12 flipping
Oh yeah.
through the channels, and you discover Jaime reading his own comic. I mean,
We should say Comics Confidential documentary.
Right, comics.
Mm,
Yeah. Well, everyone here has seen you guys' take on Comic Confidential, so they know. They're in the inner circle. They know. But thank you. Making comics on my own, that was sort of the North Star, the Love and Rockets model, right? Just create your own stories, express yourself without any editorial input, creative freedom, all that stuff, with the standards of a comic strip, right? And that's what I was doing. That's what all the work up to Zegas was, right? Even working in the industry as a job, or as you call it, like just having jobs, trying to break in. There's two stories there. There's like trying to break in and then trying to like have your vision, right? Those are two separate things sometimes. And I don't know, I think embracing genre was just sort of a way to dispel like all the insecurities that come with trying to meet those standards. You know, it's sort of like I don't need it to be the best thing. I just need to make it. I just need to create the thing and have it exist. And genre comics is like a good gateway for that. It just made it easy for me to do it. You know, it might not be someone else's trajectory, but it made it easy for me.
It's funny, we've been talking to, these shows, you just talked to Cartoonist, I don't know, 98% of my conversations with Cartoonist happen this weekend. The rest of the time I'm sitting at home alone. And this is something that I've heard a wide spectrum of cartoonists, from Bill Sienkiewicz to us sitting here now talking about, that idea of that break-in step, which I'll say is almost learning to make comics. It's that beginning piece. And once you get to a certain level of like, okay, I'm doing this, then it becomes the vision. It becomes I can make comics the way I make comics and no one else can, so I need to get that down because that's the value of the part. You get hired to be you because nobody else can do that. But that's a step. That's not step one, usually.
Right.
And it's come up several times this weekend. I think that's a trajectory most cartoonists experience at some time. If you guys are making comics and sort of frustrated at not being at that level, I think that happens over time and repetition.
I think it's a lot to unpack.
Yes.
I think.
Yeah.
Because it's also, it's expression versus survival. You want to make a career out of this. It's not a hobby. It's not, you don't wait for your muse. You have to create a thing. I think we all relate to sort of that blue collar mentality of the old school jobbers, to just make a thing, right? To respect the schedule and produce, right? And to survive. But then you also have that other side of you wanting it to be the best thing possible.
Yeah,
So
you're
I think
looking at
it's that balance.
Dan
It's
Cloud
tricky.
sports car, Frank Miller sports car, these guys who are masters of all of those elements, and that's what you're aspiring to, but it's
Right.
not, you don't come out of the gate that way. This leads to something I hope we can get into, Michel. You recently posted kind of a graph where it was putting different creators based on what their strengths were. And I often think of comics as it's almost like spinning plates, right? You need to be a good writer, you need to be a good artist, you may need to know color. There are all these elements that go into a good, successful comic. And I wonder about some of those. That graph got me thinking about what are the skills that you guys value? What makes a good comic? What are you working on your own game?
Well, that graph specifically, I made a graph that went from cartoony to realistic.
Mm-hmm.
That was the spectrum, and from messy to clean.
Yes.
And so I just put all the artists that I always look at and who inspired me on that graph, just to see where they landed. It wasn't like who was better than who.
Sure.
It's just like Sienkiewicz is realistic but super messy, and maybe not all the time, right? It was just sort of a thing just to see, just to visualize it. And it was only based on style, not who's the better writer, or what kind of output they have, or what their legacy was or is. And it was super interesting, because it was only to sort of deconstruct my own style. Because again, I don't see my style either.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think in those terms. But it was also because I just find that our values are so different amongst peers and between the reader and the creator. And I'm super interested in that. Like if someone thinks so-and-so has an ugly style, but I find it beautiful, I want to know why that is. Why do you find it ugly when I find it so beautiful? And that graph was a sort of minor step to sort of try to like unlock that.
It's funny to hear you say you don't think of yourself as a stylist, because I think of you as one of the most stylized guys working, and it's something I love about your work.
Interesting. I think it's because I did like an art page on a comic, and someone else colored it, and it just didn't look like me, and it had digital lettering, and I'm like, who is this?
I was angry about that, man. When I saw some digital lettering, like, you're one of my favorite letters of today, man, and I saw this digital lettering, and I wrote a big long email to you that I never did send. It might still be sitting in my draft.
You just tell me now.
The moment's passed. Made up for it.
Yeah, I think there's something we all share in that we do everything on our pages, and it's hard even when you take one element out of it, it just changes stuff, and like you know, especially to us, it just doesn't look right. And like I've like rarely collaborated with people, and the one time I did a book called Hobo Mom with my friend Max, who I mentioned earlier, and that was a very strange experience because our styles kind of blended pretty well, but when I look at that book, I don't even remember I drew it or like had a hand in it. Like I always forget about it. It's like this weird book that sits outside of my regular books, and when I look at it, it looks like a third cartoonist to me. Like it doesn't look like either one of us, even though it clearly is. It was a strange experience. I don't know if you guys ever had that.
I haven't, but did you ever hear of the old urban legend that Joe Matt was really a pen name whenever Seth and Chester Brown made comics together? That was a rumor I had heard when I was floating around Toronto once.
Wow.
I think you said Joe Mad first.
Interesting you brought up Joe Matt. We did a shoot interview with Tim Vigil yesterday, a 2.5-hour gig. But before that, we got dinner and we asked him what modern day artists.
And we should say, if you're not familiar with Tim Vigil, he's about as independent as you can get, kind of the patriarch of what we call outlaw comics. Very far outside of mainstream comics.
Faust is the big one. You've seen it when you were 12, when you weren't supposed to, and the Comic Book League and Defense Fund had to be created because of that. But Joe Matt is the artist he cited as a guy he's looking at. Yeah, exactly. We had the exact same reaction because two very disparate kinds of style. Yeah.
Joe Mad. Do you guys like Joe Mad?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. I brought up there was in a Wizard around the 50s. They would do these almost like MTV Cribs kind of features.
Oh, yeah.
And they went, do you remember that?
I think so, yeah.
They went to Joe Mad's studio, and it's a 2-page spread, and you saw he had a big, giant, cloud strife sword. He had a Sega Saturn, PlayStation, Genesis, Sega, Super Nintendo. He had all of this anime accoutrement. No drafting table. No T-square in sight, man.
Now that's a cool artist.
All the systems.
Yeah.
Wait, enough about Joe Mad.
Yeah.
More about you and X.
This is about us. One thing about X-Men and the idea of collaboration, because like I don't really ever see myself collaborating. Like this channel that I put together with Jim, this is like my comics collaboration. But down to the design, like there was a Comics Journal issue that Jim and I unpacked. It took us 5 hours to unpack on the channel. And there's a Dave Mazzucchelli interview in the back, and he said that he has to be like the last hand to touch the work when he's doing Marvel Comics or whatever. He has to be the last guy to sort of send it off to the publisher. So I did this variant cover for Uncle Rob Liefeld. He asked for a major X issue 0 variant cover. So I draw this thing and I do all the color and everything. Leave all of this open space at the top for the title, the masthead, and all that. Hand it off to the jobber man, the jobber staff people. They put that Marvel logo over top of all the art. There's all this black up there, and I'm like, fucking idiots. Because I delivered you so much space to do that, and and that is why I can't collaborate. Because it makes my blood boil.
Yeah, I mean that's like a thing. Like when I went to a school called the Center for Cartoon Studies.
Were you the first in the inaugural class of that?
Second class.
Okay.
And that school, it's almost the opposite of like the Joe Kubert school, where you're like, you're kind of learning one part of the trade. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but like,
I'm sure it's different.
Yeah. But CCS, it's more like, more focused on the authorship and less focused on being able to like draw well.
Yeah.
Like they barely taught me anything about drawing, which at first I was like, what the hell's going on here? But then I realized it's like pure storytelling. That's like what they're concerned with, and you know, there's writing classes, there's graphic design classes, because they want you, and all your projects have to be like a fully fleshed out design book. You're not just putting pages on the wall very often. You're usually putting mini comics together and handing them out to the whole class. So I kind of came out of just, you know, falling in love with that process and self-publishing, and that's like, it's still in me. Like I can't, it's hard for me to give up that control, even over the design or just layout of the pages, you know. It's important to me just to do all that.
I always think there's a profile of different occupations, and with Cartoonist, it's obviously the one I'm closest to, and I know the most people that are cartoonists, and that control thing is something that a lot of cartoonists I know, we have that as part of our personality. It's micromanaging, and I can only imagine working, you know, in a Marvel system, in an assembly line where you have several people's hands involved, just going crazy. Like I feel like I would be nuts every time the next person's version comes back to me, and it seems to be pretty common in cartoonists that like we want that whole thing.
Yeah.
I think the results are just so different. We're going for different things. I mean, they're all comics, but the product is so different. I mean, and to work in that assembly line sort of situation, you kind of have to let go a lot.
Yeah, I've heard
live with what
guys
happens.
describe that I guess a mental adjustment, you know, the letting go part. I do think it would be interesting to see other people write or to illustrate your scripts. You know, you have an idea in your head, but obviously it's going to be completely different whenever somebody else interprets it.
You've never done that? No one's ever drawn your script?
No. And whenever we talked to Scotty Young the other night, that was something that he talked about, you know, and he finds it very invigorating. You know, you see it and it's totally different than how you would do it. But if you're working with a good artist or an artist you like, that can be very exciting.
It made me appreciate artists in general. Like when I wrote a script for an artist I didn't pick, I wasn't familiar with, wasn't sure what his style was, really. It was weird, man. It does take some adjusting to. You know, especially me coming hot off the first 12 issues of Cobra, where I just did it all myself. It was tough. That's why I didn't letter anything. What you're talking about, I did a job where I did everything except lettering, and I didn't hand letter it because I was aware of the rewrites that I was going to have to make. And I think Rich Damaso went through something similar. He hand lettered, I think in one of the issues of Black Hammer, I think that's what he did. And he had to rewrite a bunch. Well, not rewrite it, but re-letter it by hand, and that's just sort of a small nightmare.
Yes.
In the process, in this huge process. But I kind of want to do the opposite one day and not kind of like manga style, like just maybe draw a head and like have someone else draw the background, have somebody else ink buildings.
You need an intern. I think he's looking for an intern.
I'm looking for like a staff
have
of
your
30
resumes.
people. I think it'd be super interesting.
All of us up here on the dais, are we familiar with the Japanese show Man Ben?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, there's a mangaka in Japan named Naoki Urasawa. He did a manga called Monster, 20th Century Boys, Pluto, and he has a television show that they basically set up cameras in a cartoonist studio. They film for 2-3 days, sometimes a week. They go back, they make a little film package, and Urasawa will show up to the cartoonist studio. They'll sit down and watch this footage like football plays, so, you know, Saturday before the game, and just talk process. And it is astonishing to see the amount of pages that are churned out, but also where the Japanese place their importance when it comes to making comics. And there was the guy who did Go-Go 13. He is considered the cartoonist. It's his name on the thing, but he really is a director. And if you read manga like Bakuman, there will be passages where the cartoonist, the guy whose name is on the thing, ultimately he's the writer. And when he's putting his pages together, he has all these assistants who are doing all this work, because the idea is, why should you need to know how to draw an M16 machine gun? Like, you have this whole story that you need to tell. Let me take care of the guns. He'll take care of drawing the cyclone fences, page after page. Jim will handle the perspective of the backgrounds. It's an interesting philosophy, and it's something that stuck with me too, man, because it's like, it is about pure storytelling, and the closest that we have in America to the mangaka the way they see it, really is the writer who writes 5 books a month or something, because they're churning out the same page rate as a monk, and the artists are relegated to being their assistants in a lot of ways. They act diplomatically, and whenever one person's name is on the Eisner nomination, they'll lobby to get the other guy, but that's that's good business to do that. But ultimately, that's what it is.
That's a good point. That is the closest to that system, except they don't do layouts. If they just did layouts, that'd be
One step
be
closer.
considered. Yeah, exactly, right.
We kind of started this panel talking about audience and how we began and tried to build readerships and followings, and more or less, we've done that pretty well and grown to bigger and better places. You guys are currently both on Patreon.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that experience has been in terms of you and your audience, and how you see that as just another, don't want to put words in your mouth, but possibly another extension of audience outreach, connecting to that audience, distribution. I mean, what has that experience been like to you guys?
For me, it was, part of it was like a replacement for doing subscriptions, and not having it be a pain in the ass, because like running is like how I used to do it, and how you probably did it. You would sell like 6 months at a time, so you could like make the money for your print runs for those 6 comics. But Patreon makes it a lot easier, just to organize that stuff. People can jump on, jump off at any time. So because people don't always have money, whatever, blah blah blah. And I keep it a small thing. I don't really do much outreach with it. I kind of think of it as like my core readership are on there. People who like want to read my stuff like as it comes out. So I like right now I'm doing a sci-fi comic called Automa, which comes out monthly most of the time. and it's like you only have to pay $3. Like I was like, I'm gonna make this as cheap as possible, because I know I'll get more people subscribing if it's only $3 a month. And if I get enough people, then it'll help pay for that print run and shipping. It wouldn't be a problem. I can still pay my rent. So I kind of look at it as that. It's like a subscription organizer and like a thing for like core fans, I think.
Yeah, I do it for I started it for 2 reasons, which was to make a non-Cobra comic book, just to try something else, make a webcomic exclusive to Patreon, and get back into that mode of like a page a week, and that's how it started. But also to get as geeky as I want, and not on like other social platforms. But this is where I get to talk about what I'm reading, who my influences are, and I could really go deep into like why I love Quasar. There were 3,000 words on why I love Mark Grunwald, or make a checklist of things that I love, like recommendations and sort of, and I have some engagement with that, like people show up to talk and there's a dialogue, but that's really it. It's just to create a hub for me to do that, to express myself that way.
That's what I love about your Patreon, though, is your writing. Like you love DC Comics and shit, and like you did. Was that on
Nobody
Patreon?
here loves DC Comics.
On that, did you write that Doomsday Clock thing for Patreon? And that was one of the most enjoyable things I've ever read, and it almost made me go out and buy Doomsday Clock. But then you were like,
Then you saw it.
But then you were like, no, don't do
No,
that. You're not going to do
good. I'll fight all the
But
way here.
I love the idea. I loved reading you think about it and process it. That was like way more interesting than me going in the store and picking it up.
It breaks my heart every time you guys talk shit about DC Comics, man. Because I know they weren't in a good spot in
Here
1991,
it
but
comes.
no, that's it. That's all it goes.
All right, we wanted to open it up to some questions from you guys. So anybody